Well, good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you to this evening's Grand Canyon Historical Society virtual outing. This evening, Alan Petersen, who's a GCHS board member, art curator, and art educator, will present John Wesley Powell's use of art and photography. The Grand Canyon Historical Society celebrates and promotes the study and preservation of the Grand Canyon region's cultural and natural history for the education and enjoyment of its members and the public. GCHS is the official NPS partner at the Grand Canyon for interpretation and educational services. If you are not already a member, please consider becoming a member. The dues are only $35 a year. We're an all-volunteer organization. Uh, everything we do, everything you see is we do it because of our passion for history, our passion for the Grand Canyon and Colorado River region. So please join us so we can continue to expand our many activities like these regular virtual outings. And it's so easy to do so. Just go to GrandCanyonHistory.org, our website, our URL. Click on Join or Donate at the top of the homepage. But this evening, I'm so pleased to welcome Alan Petersen, who will present again John Wesley Powell's use of art and photography. A little bit about Alan. Many of you know him, of course. He's a Grand Canyon Historical Society board member. Alan worked on the south rim of the Grand Canyon for 3 years before moving to Flagstaff in 1980 to attend Northern Arizona University. Alan recently retired from a faculty position at Coconino Community College in Flagstaff, where he taught art history, drawing, painting, and courses pertaining to the Colorado Plateau for 30 years. As curator of fine art at the Museum of Northern Arizona, Alan has curated exhibitions of work by such notable artists as Gunnar Wildforss, Joella Jean Mahoney, Mary Russell Farrell Colton, Merrill Mahaffey, Bruce Aiken, Ed Mell, Kurt Walters, Shanto Begay, and Baha Whitethorn, among many others. So I want you to all welcome Alan, who will take over from here.
So I'm going to talk about John Wesley Powell and the artists who worked with him on the Powell survey. And we'll start with a little background. And this is where I start with this slide anytime I'm talking about Powell or any of the artists who worked with him. In order to understand John Wesley Powell himself, but also the artists who worked with him and the publications they produced and the effect that they would have on their audience, you have to understand and grasp the scope and the impact of the Romantic movement. So I have some bullet points up here with key elements of Romanticism. And I'm not going to read all of them for you, but I think that the key point here, when you look at all of these aspects of Romanticism, artists, musicians, writers, anybody involved, basically they were looking at big picture ideas. You know, if you look at the first bullet point, things like God, the cosmos, and the world. Scientific exploration was very big in the 19th century throughout the world. And as a result, there is great interest in exotic places and people. And we have a lot of exotic places in the Western United States, and we have very interesting indigenous people who are living in those places. Mystery and drama were also really big flavors, I guess you could say, that affected all aspects of of the arts and during the Romantic period. One example, current example, would be Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein. A great example of that type of interest. Romantic art, music, and writing is often metaphorical. And so you can kind of keep that in mind too as we look at the work that we're going to look at. So another thing that I always start a talk like this with is this painting by Thomas Cole called A View of the Connecticut River from Mount Holyoke after a thunderstorm, commonly called the Oxbow, that Cole painted in 1846. Why do I start with this painting? First, because it's beautiful, fantastic painting, but because it shows Cole's interest in two aspects of landscape and culture and civilization in 1846. You can see that the painting is divided into two clearly different areas. On the right side of the painting, you see the Connecticut River Valley, and you see that bottom land has been carefully formed into farmland, which was incredibly difficult, hard labor. And so the farm fields you see down there represent a tremendous effort to be productive. The boats on the river, I don't know if you can I point with you? I guess I can. So if you see the boats on the river down here, they relate to commerce and the produce from the farm fields. But the left side of the painting is entirely different, and it represents wilderness. Um, and it's interesting that Cole was an early proponent of wilderness for its own intrinsic value at a time where that wasn't common at all. But it's also important to recognize that in the same time period, we have writers like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, who are beginning to shape the way that Americans view nature and wilderness. Um, And most Americans viewed wilderness as depicted in this painting by Washington Allston called Elijah in the Wilderness. The idea of wilderness did not have a good um, reputation, I guess you could say that, in the early 19th century. This is the type of wilderness people pictured if you said the word wilderness. And so you can see how Cole's painting would have been in opposition with this depiction of wilderness. And if you read early writings about landscape, writings, I can't think of his name right now, but the governor of the Massachusetts colony, the Pilgrims, he wrote very um, negative depictions of the landscape beyond the Pilgrims, beyond the Plymouth colony. So I want you to keep this painting in mind. I want you to keep both paintings in mind because that's what people were thinking of when they saw the photographs and the paintings produced by the Powell survey. Okay. The artwork produced by the Powell survey was in line with guidelines put forward by Alexander von Humboldt, the great Prussian naturalist, who undertook a 5-year expedition to South and Central America in the early 19th century. And when Humboldt returned and he began publishing his findings, one of the things that he wrote was that in an expedition of this sort, the scientists should collect copious amounts of data, collect more data than you think that you might need to support any hypotheses you put forth. That when you publish that data, you should write in a clear, concise manner. You should publish the data or format the data in tables and charts so that the data is easily digested. And he also said that you should take artists along to create visual representations of the subject matter. So these ideas from Humboldt inform all of the 19th century government surveys that took place in the United States. From the earliest ones like the Long Expedition to Colorado to the Pacific Railroad surveys to the later great surveys such as the Powell survey. So collect copious amounts of data. And if you've read any of those railroad surveys, you know that a good percentage of the publications are in fact tables and charts and lists of animals, plants, birds, insects, minerals, and etc. So let's see. And then before we actually get into looking at some artwork, I know this is a big quote to put onto a PowerPoint slide, but if you're familiar with the quote, you know how important this is. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, I'll let you read it. But this comes from the chapter. So the final report of the Powell survey was titled The Tertiary History of the Grand Canyon District, was published in 1882 and was authored by Clarence Dutton, a brilliant geologist who was enlisted by Powell and who we'll talk a little bit more about later. So I put this quote in here at the beginning because, again, like the impact of the Romantic movement, like the impact of Humboldt, and particularly with public understanding of nature and wilderness at this time, one of the key phrases in this, and this is only a portion of this longer section in the chapter about Point Sublime in the tertiary history. Two of the key ideas here are that most people on the East Coast, which is where most of Powell's and Dutton's audience would be, in the eastern, large eastern cities, Dutton realized that what he was going to describe and show people would have been utterly foreign to 99% of them. Joe the tanner in New Jersey or Bill the bookbinder in Manhattan. Anybody who had any understanding of nature would have found the images that I'm going to show you. Abhorrent wouldn't be too big of a word. Think of Elijah in the Wilderness, the painting by Alston. That's what people had in mind. And as we'll see, Powell and Dutton and the artists, to a degree, proved that right. So Dutton says that if you love mountains like the Alps in Italy and Germany, or if you like the Appalachians, or the Rockies of Colorado, if you come to the Colorado Plateau, you're going to see an entirely different landscape, one that's going to shock you, and that the chances are you're not going to find it beautiful. But he does say that by studying it and by looking at its various aspects, that with time you can come to appreciate it. And so, to a large degree, John Wesley Powell, Clarence Dutton, and the artists who we're going to look at tonight gave us the tools, gave us the information, gave us the background and the imagery and the writing, particularly in the case of Dutton, that would slowly turn the Colorado Plateau and the Grand Canyon into one of the biggest tourist attractions on planet Earth. And now, people love these types of landscapes. But as Dutton said, it did take time. And the two artists who accompanied Lieutenant Ives on his 1858 expedition up the Colorado River basically, I think we could say, proved Dutton right, because although both Mulhausen and Egloffstein had artistic training, I think you can see in Mulhausen's drawing of Havasupai Canyon here, were at a bit of a loss to accurately describe the landscape they were looking at. So Mulhausen was an artist. Well, he was primarily a writer, but he could draw. He did do watercolors, but you can see that in this drawing of Havasupai Canyon, one of the side canyons that the Ives party traveled down. He's overly generalized the nature of the erosion of the strata in Havasupai Canyon. And really those talus slopes and promontories on the left side of the drawing, they almost look more like grain silos than they do the pattern of erosion that we see in the Grand Canyon. Okay, so Mulhausen was probably conceptually challenged, I guess we could say. And his comrade, his artistic comrade, Fredrick von Egloffstein, was actually an extremely talented artist. And it was through some quirk of fate that these drawings made by Egloffstein wound up in the Ives report. And you can see in the title of the slide I wrote, where on earth is this? Because it's certainly not the Grand Canyon. Well, the interesting thing about these Ives drawings is for almost 150 years, people have been asking this, people who know the Grand Canyon have been asking this question, what on earth was Egloffstein eating or drinking? What led him to these utterly fantastic drawings that look nothing like Grand Canyon? And people were stumped and made efforts to try to understand what motivated Egloffstein. And in, I think it was 2008, due to brilliant observation by a fellow named Jeremy Miller, and making a long story short, Miller realized that in fact, these are not the Grand Canyon, they're the Black Canyon of the Gunnison in southwestern Colorado. And Miller published his findings and brilliant research in an in a edition of Harper's Magazine. I think it was in 2010, if I recall. If you haven't read that, it's an absolutely fascinating article that makes complete sense of Egloffstein's drawings. How did they wind up in the Ives report? We don't know exactly, but they could have been misfiled. They might have been um, whoever's working on the Ives report maybe grabbed the wrong portfolio of the drawings. We'll never know probably exactly what happened. But the fact is that Egloffstein was in the 1853-54 winter expedition to southwestern Colorado led by John C. Fremont. And that's where the drawings that became these reproductions were done. And if you didn't know that already, probably as soon as I said that, you went, oh my gosh, of course. As soon as I read Miller's article, I went, oh my God, of course. Why did it take 150 years for people to recognize that? Anyway, so the first couple of artists to visit the Grand Canyon were challenged. And if you've been down to Diamond Creek, to the mouth of Diamond Creek, you can tell that Egloffstein's drawing is absolutely not the mouth of Diamond Creek. And if you look at Mulhausen's drawing of purportedly the same location, yeah, it kind of looks like Diamond Creek, but there are some serious geological deficiencies. Let's just put it that way. We do, however, have one of the intrepid explorers you can see pointing downstream to his faithful Native American guide here. So anyway, now it turns out that in 1857, there was a major publication, republication of Dante's Inferno, illustrated by the popular French artist and illustrator Gustave Doré. And I point this out not because it necessarily inspired Egloffstein. We know now that it didn't, because Egloffstein's drawings predate this by about 5 or 6 years. But again, as we go through the artwork tonight, I want you to keep in mind the impact of the Romantic movement, okay? And how people who saw Egloffstein's drawings were initially all government employees, maybe congressmen, geologists, earth scientists, and meaning that they were well read. And it's not at all unlikely that they didn't read this edition of Dante's Inferno. And, we're familiar with Doré's illustrations. Okay. So again, kind of keep these in the front of your mind as we go forward. And of course, this fabulous quote by Ives, in which he completely misses the boat. And it's important to keep in mind that following the Lewis and Clark expedition and the acquisition of so much Western territory in the next couple of decades, the government, the federal government, and private businesses were looking to the West because they wanted to cash in on what they, assumed were valuable mineral resources, which of course there are some, but also they were looking at, this vast wealth of arable, potential farmland and abundant water that would come with that, which in retrospect, we all know was a pipe dream. And John Wesley Powell was the first to call them out on that in his publication, The Report on the Arid Lands, which I'll come back to a little bit later. So Ives' quote is entirely about the fact that what he saw as he traversed, our neighborhood on the Colorado Plateau is there's very little arable land, and what little arable land there is does not come with abundant water. And despite this, people still persisted in imagining that the West was going to be this great Garden of Eden. Okay. And two, before we actually get to the artists who worked with Powell, I want to point out that the first professional artist, so Egloffstein was a topographic artist. He was very skilled, but he wasn't really a professional artist as such. He worked primarily as a surveyor and, as I said, topographic artist. The first trained professional artist to actually do paintings of the Grand Canyon was a New Yorker by the name of Samuel Coleman, who in 1870, so in between Powell's two river expeditions, did a big loop through the West. He took a stagecoach, well, he took the train out to Green River, got on a stagecoach there and kind of wandered around, wound up in California. I believe he visited Yosemite Valley, and then he worked his way back east. And in doing so, he went through at least Peach Springs and did this watercolor painting on location there that he later turned into a few different versions as oil paintings. This is one of them. So anyway, so I just want to kind of give a little credit to Samuel there. Oh, and I just put this in just a few minutes ago. Again, I know it's kind of a lot of text for a slide, but just to give a little a timeline and some chronological context for what we're about to see. So the Ives report was published in 1861. After his summers in the Front Range in Colorado, Powell did publish various relatively short government reports on his findings. In 1873, he convinces Thomas Moran to come visit him on the North Rim. And a couple of years later, Powell begins publishing the accounts of his river expeditions and his work in the Grand Canyon region. In Scribner's Monthly, which we'll see some examples of. Later that same year, the Smithsonian takes all of those periodical publications, supplements them with a great deal more material, and publishes report of the exploration. It's a long title. You can read it. Exploration of the Colorado River of the West. In 1880, William Henry Holmes comes out to work with Clarence Dutton on the North Rim for a few weeks. And 2 years later, the final report of the Powell Survey is published, The Tertiary History of the Grand Canyon District. Okay, so there's just kind of a little timeline for you. So Powell regretted not having an artist on his initial 1869 river trip. He certainly was familiar with Humboldt. I'm not sure why he didn't take an artist, but we do know that he had a group of men that had worked with him in Colorado who he trusted and who he knew could do the job of, getting themselves relatively safely down the Colorado River with all of its unknowns. So in his second river expedition, 1871 to 72, Powell did enlist an artist, and a photographer. And the photographer was E.O. Beaman, and the artist he enlisted was Fredrick Dellenbaugh. And I was going to look up I was going to look up a few more facts on Dellenbaugh before we started. But as I recall, he was pretty young. He wasn't 20 years old. Um, but I don't remember exactly how old he was. But he was a youngster. That's the point. Um, and we'll come back to Dellenbaugh in just a minute here. Anyway, there they are. Famous photograph by Beaman at Green River. Um, And I'm not going to show you a lot of photography. That's really kind of a whole other topic. But everything that I'm going to show you shows the use of photography by Powell. And so here are just a couple of examples. A photograph by Beaman early in the 1871 excursion. Um, you may know that Beaman and Powell had a falling out, mostly related to business affairs and how they were going to share the photographs and any profits made from the photographs that Beaman made. And after a short tenure by a second photographer, Mr. Fennemore, who seemed to prove unfit for the hardships of expedition life, Jack Hillers, who was hired on as a boatman and the assistant to Beaman, took over photographic duties in the spring of 1872. And and we'll see some more of Hillers' work here. And I think, Hillers is one of my heroes. Hillers was hired, he was an immigrant, he was from Germany, and Powell um, ran into him in Salt Lake City as he was making preparations to depart on the 1871 river survey. And Hillers was, as I said, in addition to being hired as a boatman, he was hired to be an assistant to Beaman. And Hillers learned photography on the go from Beaman. And after he replaced Beaman in the spring of 1872, Hillers went on to become one of the great early frontier photographers. And I just am always amazed by the ability that he showed. Anyway, so here are two river level views, one by Beaman in the midst of Split Mountain in the Canyon of Lodore. And sitting on the sandbar is young Fredrick Dellenbaugh. The photo on the right you can see is Almond Thompson, Powell's brother-in-law, who was kind of his second in command in Marble Canyon. And based on the background I was giving you about the Romantic movement and taking into account Dutton's advice on understanding this landscape, it's not an overstatement to say that people viewing these photographs in eastern cities would have been shocked by this landscape. And Powell did travel and do speaking engagements, giving what were called magic lantern, shows. That is using glass slides made from reproductions made from the original plates, and giving slide talks like we're doing right here, right now, which with much more basic technology. So his audiences would have looked at these photos and just thought, what are these guys doing here? This is crazy. This is Gustave Doré's vision of hell, and those little devils in those prints. So and we can say that about almost everything I'm going to show you tonight. Okay. Um, these images would have been met with shock. So Richard Corderoli, hi Richard, sent in a question that I want to address right now. Okay, because when I saw that email, Richard, I couldn't believe it because I've had the same question for many, many years at this point. So Richard said, um, I've had no luck finding Dellenbaugh illustrations of the Grand Canyon from 1872 River Trip other than some in his books. So Dellenbaugh did publish a couple of books. One of them was an account of the 1871-72 expedition. And as I was preparing this talk, I thought, doggone it, I've never seen Dellenbaugh's drawings. When he was hired to be the artist. He was also Powell was not at all opposed to nepotism. Dellenbaugh was, I believe, a cousin. He was a family member at any rate, which is why he was hired. And he was an artist and he could handle small boats. But one of his primary tasks was to, as they floated downstream, he was to draw a running profile of the rim of the canyon as they went along. So basically, a nearly endless panorama is what it would have wound up being. Where are those drawings? I have no idea. I wish I did because I'd love to see them. The interesting thing about Dellenbaugh and that kind of monumental task that he was given is that, bless his heart, he wasn't a great painter. Um, he was reasonably prolific, but he kind of struggled actually, I think. And if you look at his books, you can see some of his paintings. They're proficient, but not inspiring. Let's just put it that way. So yeah, I would love to see those original drawings. And I think with, a little research, one could probably track them down. So there you go, Richard. Sorry, I can't answer your question. I wish I could. Um, One more thing before we move on. Where did the Canyon of Lodore or the Gates of Lodore get its name? So most of you probably know the story, but it's worth repeating because, again, it's absolutely an indication of the effect of the Romantic movement. So as they floated down the river towards Split Mountain, they were reading, they must have had a book of poetry, and they were reading a poem titled The Cataract of Lodore, written in 1820 by a British poet named Robert Southey, who went on to become a poet laureate of England. Um, so here they are floating down a river toward this, what's going to be, magnificent, stupendous, awe-inspiring, threatening landscape. And they're reading full-blown romantic poem. So they're utterly immersed in this kind of romantic milieu, I guess you could say. Okay. So the only other photograph I'm going to show you is this one taken by Hillers in the spring of 1872, when Hillers, along with Thompson and a few other men, traveled up across the Aquarius Plateau. It's not the Grand Canyon, but it's looking southeast from the Aquarius Plateau to Navajo Mountain, and basically across Capitol Reef. So the only thing about this format I don't like is I can't actually ask you questions. So my question to you is, do you remember the painting of Elijah in the Wilderness by Washington Alston? This photograph would absolutely, okay, so that's not this, is it? Absolutely not. On the other hand, maybe it is this. And when people would have viewed that photograph by Hillers, this is what they would have immediately, and they might not have been familiar with this particular painting by Alston, but this is what they would have had in their mind's eye. Okay. So there would have been no appreciation of beauty from this photograph. What there would have been was, holy cow, I hope my wagon doesn't break down there someday. Okay. All right. So let's talk about the two artists who did most of the work for John Wesley Powell and Clarence Dutton. The first to be employed by the Powell Survey was Thomas Moran. And you may know that Thomas Moran got his feet wet in the West in 1871 when he joined Ferdinand Hayden on his survey of the Yellowstone region. Moran had never been west before. He lived in Philadelphia. He was working, his day job was he was working as a printmaker, making woodcut prints for Scribner's Magazine and other popular magazines at that time. He was highly regarded. People, publishers in Philadelphia knew of the skill of his work. And it was natural that things would kind of fall in place such that he was invited to join Hayden on this trip to Yellowstone in 1871. And when you look at Moran's work, I mean, his later work after he came west, you can kind of imagine that this was really a natural transition for him because prior to coming to Yellowstone, Moran was also, he was a painter, but he was doing very kind of typical paintings of Eastern woodland landscapes and Eastern coastal landscapes. And he was a big fan of the English painter Turner. Turner was his hero. And so I can't help but think that as a young 20-something painter, Moran was probably really frustrated with the landscapes he was painting in the East and yearning for something grander. So he goes on this expedition to Yellowstone, comes back to Philadelphia, and produces this epic size painting of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone. Um, it's also worth mentioning too, just for further context, that in a really weird kind of way, geology was extremely popular for the educated people in America and Europe at this time. People paid as much as you would pay to go to a concert today to go listen to a top-notch geologist give a lecture on some aspect of geology. Hard to believe, but that's absolutely true. So geology was immensely popular, and the people who would have been patrons of, well-known popular artists, again, being educated, being hip to new cool things, they would have also been up on geology. Okay, so artists like Moran would have known this, and they would have known, they would have had to think to themselves, if I want to sell paintings, if I maybe want to get a commission from this guy, I need to understand geology and I need to be able to accurately depict it in my paintings so that they sell. Because that was their audience, the upper, wealthy people who had been educated and hip to geology. So that's another kind of little view into what was going on artistically at this time. So Moran goes back to Philadelphia. He produces this huge painting. He in mid-January he texted Ferdinand Hayden, who was down in Washington D.C., and he says, "Hey, Dr. Hayden, I'm almost done with this big painting. Can you come up and kind of check out the geology for me?" Um, and Hayden texted back. He said, "You betcha, Thomas. I'll be up there next weekend. How's that sound?" So Hayden goes up to Philadelphia. He looks at the painting. And he says something like, "By Jove, Thomas, that's stellar. You've got it." And Moran goes, "Yeah, okay." He finishes the painting in April and he exhibits it for, I think it was a couple of weeks in Philadelphia in a gallery, puts it on a wagon, takes it down to Washington, D.C. And, okay, so a little flashback. You may know that Yellowstone became a national park in March of 1872. And that was due to Ferdinand Hayden pushing it through Congress. And how did Hayden do that? Well, he had photographs taken by William Henry Jackson, and he had watercolors painted in the field by Thomas Moran. So art is absolutely responsible for the creation of Yellowstone as the first national park. And I mention this because well, for several reasons, but one of them is that this painting is often erroneously credited as being responsible for the creation of Yellowstone, and this painting wasn't completed when Yellowstone became a national park. So there you go. But certainly in the audience in the Capitol when Hayden was testifying about Yellowstone would have been John Wesley Powell. And later during that session of Congress, Powell, along with Hayden, along with Clarence King, and along with Lieutenant Wheeler, were also testifying before Congress in order to get their budgets for the coming field season. So Powell would have seen the work by Moran, and when Moran delivered the painting to Washington, D.C., because he was hoping, he was kind of counting on Congress buying it, um, Powell would have been there to see this painting. And if you know anything about John Wesley Powell, one of his character traits was he was a great self-promoter. And I like to imagine that when Powell first saw this painting, he was probably gobsmacked and a little light bulb went on over his head. And he thought to himself, I got to get this guy out to the Grand Canyon. And so he started working on trying to convince Powell or Moran to come out to the Grand Canyon with him in the summer of 1872. And there's actually an interesting series of letters between Powell and Moran after Moran had returned to Philadelphia. In essence, Powell says, Mr. Moran, I was so excited to see your painting of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone. I'd like to invite you to join me this summer at the Grand Canyon of the Colorado for a landscape that will blow your mind. I'm paraphrasing. Um, so please, please come join me. Moran writes back and says to Powell, Dear Mr. Powell, I'm sorry, but I have further obligations to Dr. Hayden, and I won't be able to join you this year, but perhaps in the future. Powell writes a second letter to Moran, and again, paraphrasing a little bit, he says, Dear Mr. Moran, I don't think you understand. I'm talking about the Grand Canyon of the Colorado River, which is magnificent in every aspect, et cetera, blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera. Moran writes back and he says, Dear Mr. Powell, maybe you don't understand. I said I'm busy. And that actually goes on for a few more letters between the two. The effect being that Moran's not going to come to the Grand Canyon in 1872. Powell was probably devastated. But it turns out that the following year, Moran had a commission to do some drawings of Yosemite Valley for a publication, for a popular publication called Picturesque America. And so Moran calls up Powell and he says, Major, turns out I'm going to be coming your way late this summer on my way to California. Could I join you at the Grand Canyon? And Powell writes back and says, You betcha, Tom, get on out here. So in August, Moran takes the train to Salt Lake City, takes a stagecoach from Salt Lake down to Kanab, and meets up with a Powell party where they're camped, in their field camp there. And I've got to mention too that, and again, you might know this story, but Moran did in fact sell Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone to Congress for $10,000, which was a fantastic sum of money in 1872. And depending on how you convert that currency, it winds up being anywhere from between $600,000 and $1.2 million. And every time I tell that story, it just kind of stops me because prior to this painting, Moran was basically a nobody. He was a local painter doing local scenes who earned his keep doing woodblock prints for publications. And so not only does he become fantastically wealthy like that, but he also becomes a celebrity. He becomes the rock star artist of the United States. And so for Powell to get him to come out to the Grand Canyon is a major coup. So now one thing you might know about Moran's paintings is they tend to be a little overstated and even hyperbolic, as we're going to see. But the fact is he was a great draftsman. And I'm hoping that this slide of this drawing that he made out at Toroweap comes across okay on your screens because it's a beautiful drawing, absolutely just killer drawing, totally accurate. I field checked it. I took the reproductions out there and I looked at the landscape and looked at his drawings, and everything is pretty much exactly as it should be. If you've been out to Torrey, this is Torrey Point. Colorado River's way down, excuse me, way down here. Here's oh, oh God, I can't think of what that's called now. But over here's Mount Signala. So if that's Mount Signala, this means that this is the mouth of Havasupai Canyon. The dome. Here's the dome over here on the north side of the river. So Moran can draw. Okay, that's the key point there. So Powell leaves Moran in the care of Almond Thompson and Clarence Dutton. And I think that Powell actually, I don't remember right now, but I think Powell actually went out onto what we now call Powell Plateau. And while they are out there, they witness this, thunderstorm. And if you've ever experienced a thunderstorm on the rim of the Grand Canyon, you know that it's actually a sublime experience, to use that word correctly, meaning that it's something that's really beautiful, but also potentially threatening, and potentially in a big way if you're exposed on the rim. So Moran goes out Powell Plateau, does a few drawings out there. They go over to the Kaibab Plateau and he does a few drawings out there. He works his way to Yosemite, goes back to Philadelphia, and over the winter of 1873-74 produces this painting called The Chasm of the Colorado, which you can see is the exact same size as the Yellowstone painting, and which he envisioned as a companion piece, and which again he also hoped, and now sort of maybe almost assumed that Congress might buy this from him also. So he gets to work in his studio over the winter of 1873-74. Again, in January, he texts Powell, who's in Washington, and he says, "Dear Major, I'm making fine progress on my large painting of the Chasm of the Colorado. Would you mind dropping by my studio and just checking my geology for me?" Again, he asks him that. And Powell texts back and says, "You bet, Thomas, I'll be right up because I want to see this." And Powell goes to visit Moran in Philadelphia. Powell says, as did Ferdinand Hayden, "By Jove, Thomas, look at this painting. You even got our thunderstorm in there." And so Tom is glowing. He's like totally on top of the world. So Powell goes back to Washington. Moran finishes the painting. And same thing, exhibits it briefly in New York City, takes it down to Washington, D.C., and son of a gun, if Congress doesn't spend another $10,000 on this painting. So Moran becomes doubly fantastically wealthy, becomes doubly the rock star artist, and develops a little attitude to go with that. Now, the thing about this painting, much more so than the painting of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, is that this landscape does not exist. This is an entirely fabricated landscape made up of recognizable landmarks, temples or the buttes of the Inner Grand Canyon. But everything that you see within the chasm of the canyon has been taken from separate drawings and, as we would say today, copied and pasted to create this painting. So it's a fanciful depiction of the Grand Canyon. And nonetheless, it's a killer painting. And it's really great to see these two paintings together in the National Gallery, along with another painting that Moran did of Shoshone Falls a few years later. All same size, same format, all three paintings in the same alcove in the National Museum. So prior to 1875, Powell didn't publish anything aside from some relatively skimpy reports on his doings out west and trying to be responsible. They were basically reports made to Congress detailing how he used the meager amount of money that they gave him, but also reporting in a fairly small way on the findings as they were at that point. Eventually, following, I think, some pressure from friends and colleagues, in a series of 3 articles published in January, February, and March of 1875 in Scribner's Monthly, the same magazine Moran worked for, Powell publishes a series of 3 articles. And who did he turn to do the illustrations for those articles? Thomas Moran. And so this is one of the illustrations that Moran did for one of those for the March issue of Scribner's, along with several other illustrations. Now, again, this is kind of a strange reproduction because of the way that translates from the woodcut print to a digital image. So I hope it looks okay on your screen. But the key point about this image, titled The Grand Canyon of the Colorado, is that it's utterly fanciful. Utterly fanciful. And it's also worth remembering, and I'll point this out again a little bit later, that Moran did not go down to the river in his 1873 visit to the Grand Canyon. So what he's portrayed here is something more akin to Egglofstein's Black Canyon drawings and Doré's illustrations for the Divine Comedy, and something meant to inspire awe and maybe a little fear and trepidation, but certainly not an accurate representation of the Grand Canyon. So one of the many interesting things about Moran, aside from the fact that he was a little grandiose, is that he was an early adopter of photography as a tool to aid in doing artwork. And so I'm going to show you a few examples of that. So on the left is the photograph we saw earlier taken by Jack Hillers in Marble Canyon of Almond Thompson looking out over the river. On the right is one of the illustrations that Thomas Moran did for Scribner's, later also used in the book, The Exploration of the Colorado River and its Tributaries, and also used in the tertiary history. So this woodcut print made by Moran on the right was used for at least 3 different purposes. And it's beautiful. Oh my gosh. Am I talking too much? I see it's almost 7 o'clock. So I'll try to pick it up a little bit. Anyway, beautiful print, but also notice if you look at the photograph, if you look at the strata, notice how Moran has enlarged things almost 50% for greater impact. Notice too how he put the intrepid explorers in their boats on the river down here. Here's another well-known example, Hiller's photograph of the 2 boats in Marble Canyon. On the right is Moran's version of the scene. Notice how he's altered it a little bit. And again, he's exaggerated the vertical scale by, again, maybe 50%. Just a couple of other quick examples of some of the illustrations made in the Scribner's articles. Really meant to impress people with the magnitude of the landscape that they were writing about. And as we know, it wasn't all fun and games. And so in the Scribner's articles and in the exploration in the book, Powell and Moran included scenes of, actually these aren't, one's by Moran, one's by another artist, but they included the scenes of the famous wreck at Disaster Falls, and then the famous kitchen fire in the print on the right, which I always kind of get a kick out of. and of course, the famous rescue. And also, it's worth remembering, and again, you may know this. Maybe I know you know this. All these publications, the Scribner's articles, and then the book version, conflate the two river expeditions into one, tending to focus on the first one, but also mixing in incidents and, of course, the artwork made in the second expedition. But there were also a few images that were a little bit more almost pastoral, a little bit less threatening, a little more attractive, including these two scenes of the Kolob Terrace up in what's now Zion National Park. And I love the title of the one, A Midsummer Day's Dream. Again, kind of trying to set a poetic mood there. There were geological illustrations, as you can see in the two drawings on the right here. And again, another, fantastic view of the canyon as a chasm on the right by Moran. And again, none of these are this, right? So everybody in the East Coast, the businessmen, the congressmen, the leaders are looking at those images being, published by Powell and saying to themselves and their colleagues, "Oh, the West doesn't really look that inviting, does it? Are we going to be able to farm there? Are we going to be able to access natural resources?" Okay. And it's really more like this, right? More like Gustave Doré's images of the Inferno. And on the page, in Scribner's, where the print on the right made by Thomas Moran, the text on the page opposite, Powell says, "A few more days like this and we should be out of prison." Meaning they're expecting to be through the Grand Canyon and an open country. But again, it just reinforces what readers are seeing in the images. Okay, so again, I'm not going to read this. I don't want to spend much time on this because I don't want to take too much. I think I need to speed it up a little bit. Again, keeping in mind the images I showed you, keeping in mind Dutton's basically admonition to forget about the beautiful places you know and think about learning about this new type of landscape. Okay. So the second artist hired by John Wesley Powell and Clarence Dutton was William Henry Holmes. In 1875, Clarence Dutton, who was an active duty Army officer and a gifted geologist, was hired by Powell to be the field director of the Powell Survey because Powell was spending more and more time in Washington, D.C. And he was also beginning his work on another publication, the Report on the Arid Lands of the Western United States, which was published in when was that? 1875? I'm guessing there. I think maybe it was 78. Anyway, I think it was 78. Okay, so anyway, so he hires Dutton to take over the field operations. And when the survey was concluded in 1880, Dutton hires William Henry Holmes to join him to do some drawings of the canyon and the surrounding country. And among the work that Holmes did was this beautiful watercolor of these buttes just west of Fredonia, which you can see if you drive on the highway there. So let's see. Here we go. Okay. So like Moran, Holmes got his start in the West working for Ferdinand Hayden. And Holmes worked for Hayden for something like, I don't know exactly, but roughly, we could say probably 5 or 6 years, 5 or 6 field seasons. This is one of his drawings of the Front Range. Okay. Holmes worked primarily in Colorado with Hayden. So Holmes joins Dutton at the Grand Canyon, and he spends a few weeks doing field drawings like this beautiful drawing of the East Kaibab monocline as seen from Dog Point on the east side of the Kaibab Plateau. So most of the drawings that Holmes did were two sheets. These are large sheets of paper. They're 24 inches across, so maybe the height is 16 inches. And they're pencil. I hope you can see how beautiful the drawing is. And it's a stupendous drawing, absolutely stupendous drawing. So when it was reproduced in the tertiary history, this is what it looked like. So in a publication like this, the artist would turn their drawings over to a master printmaker who would then, in this case, do a drawing on a piece of limestone that was used to create a lithographic print, which was fairly new technology at that time. And so again, if I could actually interact with you, I would say, so what do you think about this drawing? Do you have faith in its accuracy? And I ask that because when we see a drawing or a painting or a photograph that looks super accurate like this, we tend to trust it. We tend to accept its accuracy. And we know today, especially with social media and AI and everything that's happening now, most of us now know that you can't trust anything, essentially, right? And despite Holmes's incredible skill as a draftsman, in fact, he did manipulate this drawing. So, oops, sorry, wrong one. I also field checked all of these drawings by Holmes, and it turns out, you see these little hogback ridges down here? Hopefully you can see those. In fact, in the real landscape, they're spaced further apart. And so Holmes has compressed the space in order to create a stronger composition. Okay? So despite the seeming accuracy of this, there is some manipulation. Not on the scale of Thomas Moran's usual exaggeration, but so one of the most beautiful drawings that Holmes did was from what today is the Woodforest Trail leading out to Woodforest Point. He did a view looking to the east with a view of Zoroaster Temple, Oza Butte, Deva Temple, Brahma Temple, and here are the San Francisco peaks in the background. And again, I mean, well, first, isn't that an absolutely stunning drawing? But again, there's a bit of manipulation here because, again, it's done in two sheets and a geologist in Holmes. So Holmes was, in addition to being an artist, he learned geology while working with Hayden. And by the third season that he worked with Hayden, he was actually working as a geologist, not so much as an artist. And so when he was doing a drawing like this, he wanted to get as much information in it as he could. And so in order to include all of the, all the inner canyon features that we see here, after he'd finished the one drawing, and I believe it was the drawing on the right, he actually walked about 200 yards further south along that trail, the Woodforest Trail, in order to do the east half of the drawing so that he could get all of these features in. Interesting. Then they gave those drawings to Thomas Moran, who did this painting. Now, this is a duotone reproduction in the Atlas of the Tertiary History, but Moran would have produced it as a full color painting. So Moran took Holmes' drawings and produced this. So it was a collaborative effort. And if you look closely, do you see the intrepid explorers down here? And of course, the real tour de force of the tertiary history and its atlas is this three-part panorama of the view from Point Sublime, keeping in mind that it was Clarence Dutton who named, excuse me, Point Sublime. And it's just an absolute landscape knockout. Um, Holmes said that it took him 3 days to produce this. And again, keep in mind that this is a reproduction that would have been drawn in a studio by a printmaker from the field drawings given to him by Holmes. Okay, so there's color here. There's no suggestion it was even a pencil drawing at any point. It's a multicolored lithograph, a chromolithograph, which again was new technology then. And do you see, again, the little figures down here in the left foreground? So who is that? Some of you might know. Is it Clarence Dutton leaning over the shoulder of William Henry Holmes while he's at work on the scene, saying, "By Jove, Bill, you've got it." Or he might be saying, maybe the red wall over there could be a little bit taller, or who knows. So it's Clarence Dutton and William Henry Holmes, right? Well, turns out it might represent them, but it wasn't them originally. So when Holmes was working with Hayden in Colorado, William Henry Jackson took this photograph on the left of Hayden looking over the shoulder of Walter Paris, another artist working on that survey at that time. Gotta love it. Now, what I think is one of the most amazing things, so we're almost done, two more pictures here. Hope I'm not keeping you from your dinner. One of the most amazing things among many of the tertiary history is the fact that in many cases, due to the brilliance of Holmes and Dutton, collectively and individually, is there are passages and visual and illustrations in the tertiary history that work exactly like what we would call hypertext today. What do I mean by that? Well, this is one example, one of several examples. So the drawing made by Holmes, the two drawings made by Holmes, keeping in mind he was a geologist, shows three different aspects, three different, what's the word? I can't think of it right now. Aspects of the Hurricane Fault, one of the major faults of the North Rim and the South Rim in the Western Grand Canyon. So we have the field drawing made by Holmes. We have his geological interpretation of it, clearly indicating where the faults are. And then in, oops, I don't remember which page it is, but on the page in which Dutton is discussing the Hurricane Fault, he says refer to plate 22 and the map in the atlas, the map we see on the left, again, a chromolithograph. Probably it's safe to say the first color-coded geological map ever made, or one among them. And so Dutton is using a technique, again, similar to what we would consider to be hypertext today. Not that you could click on it or anything like that, but linking together multiple bits of data in an easily understood manner. Now, the amazing thing about Holmes, and this is where I'm going to leave you tonight, the amazing thing about Holmes is that while he could do these absolutely photographically accurate pencil drawings, he was also a fairly amazing painter. And at the same time he was working on those drawings, at some point he found the time to take a break and to do this beautiful watercolor painting of the canyon, which I just love. I wish I had a print on my wall of that. So John Wesley Powell, Clarence Dutton, and the artists who worked for them didn't simply seek to blow people away, which they did, and which they could easily have done with little effort. They were educating the public about a remarkable region of the United States and landscapes unlike, like I said earlier, 99% of their audience would have been familiar with, had seen, let alone be familiar with. And one of the fantastic things about the publications and the artwork is they continue to educate people today.